As recently as September of 2024, this man, James Kelly, watched as a portal opened at the foot of his bed, and then 4 massive figures stepped through. 2 of them grabbed James before he even realized what was happening. One placed a cold hand on his forehead, and instantly, James was paralyzed. The plan? Kill James, and then extract his Starseed DNA. For 5 decades, James had lived a double life, a loving husband, a father of 6, and the target of an interstellar conflict that had been raging for millions of years. James became this target in this war because of his very unique DNA. The way that Amy and I understand it, and we really don't understand it, is that some part of his DNA is slightly out of phase, making it completely invisible to modern science and perhaps the next step in human evolution. And this out-of-phase DNA has some extremely unique properties that another alien species desperately needs in order to save their race, and they will do anything that it takes to acquire it. And this night in September of 2024, they had decided that what James had to offer was just too valuable, and they were going to kill him and take it. To get a better understanding of this strange DNA and the war that James was involved with, we really need to go back to 1972, because that was the year that James himself found out that he was different. He was out in his backyard, 6 years old, gazing up at the stars when one of them began to grow. Well, James watched it for a second, and then he realized that, no, it wasn't growing, it was moving toward him at this incredible speed. Well, it got right up on him, and the very next instance, James found himself inside of a white room with a strange-looking woman staring over him. She told James that her name was Loren, and that she was from a planet in the Arcturus star system. A moment later, he was experiencing lush forests, deep blue oceans, and purple skies, and beauty that was something more than majestic. And he was instantly enveloped in this amazingly strong sense of love and belonging. He, of course, was experiencing her planet, and it was extremely different than Earth. Wow, if her planet was any indication of what life is like out away from Earth, then the universe is an amazing place. Unfortunately, James would soon discover that not every alien species was like hers. No, some of them are downright empty, malevolent, and methodical.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
As James grew older, he never forgot that moment in his backyard, and it always gave him a sense of peace about the universe. But just 2 years later, in the summer of 1974, that feeling of peace would be shattered with the appearance of another alien race. James was sitting outside with his family after dark, enjoying the evening, when suddenly somebody pointed to the sky and asked, "What is that?"
What is that?
Well, everyone looked up and they saw this mysterious craft just kind of hovering over their heads. But before anyone could really make any sense of it, it shot up into the distance at an incredible speed and vanished into the night sky.
Later that night, I was awakened by the sounds of footsteps coming down the hall and stopping just outside of my bedroom door. I thought it might have been my sister Shannon, but when I rolled over, I saw 2 gray figures standing in the doorway. Their big black eyes stared at me, unblinking.
James watched as these 2 figures walked into his bedroom. He said that they didn't move like normal people. He said that for some reason, it felt as if they were working very hard to keep their balance as they went.
Their skin appeared to be mostly gray with hints of black, maroon, and white. It reminded me of smooth, wet clay that you'd use to make pottery. They had very large black eyes that dominated their heads, which were almond-shaped. The beings had a little nose with 2 small slits at the end. Their arms and legs were very skinny and disproportionate to their body, with long fingers. They stopped at my bedside and looked at me, but their eyes weren't fixed on mine. Their heads kept moving back and forth, as if they were scanning me for something. I grabbed my blanket and I closed my eyes. I wished they would just go away, but every time I opened my eyes, they were still there.
James tried to yell for his mother, but he found out that he had no voice. And then he tried to get up and run, and he found out that he couldn't even move. Somehow, they had completely immobilized him. Well, a few moments later, James found himself floating down the hall toward the basement with these two gray aliens alongside of him. In the basement was the furnace room. Were they taking him to the furnace? Well, at this point, James just knew that they were going to kill him. But they stopped right outside of the door that led to the furnace. Then James noticed this pinprick of light at the center of the door that grew larger and larger.
The circle pulsed from the middle out and made a soft humming noise. As soon as it was large enough, we all passed through. As soon as we crossed the threshold, I noticed that we were entering a room that was not the furnace room. I realized at that moment that I was no longer at my house.
They placed James on this metal table when they locked his hands and feet down with these metal straps. Well, to make a long story short, this turned into a full-blown alien examination, full of all of the nightmarish horrors that are known to accompany these types of abductions. You've heard the type, I'm sure. No anesthetics, taking all sorts of bodily samples, fluids. But something that I thought was worth mentioning was when James asked why him, they said that it was because of his gifts of consciousness. Gifts of consciousness. What gifts of consciousness did James have that others don't? Well, that would be the answer to this entire mystery. Finally, when this nightmare was over, James woke up in his bed, certain that he would find marks all over his body, but he didn't. Not knowing any better, he ended up calling these gray aliens the furnace people. And thank God that the furnace people were now gone. Unfortunately for James, these furnace people were not going to stay gone forever. After these beings had paralyzed, kidnapped, and then tortured this poor boy, looking for some magical strand of out-of-phase DNA, his gifts of consciousness, James, understandably, had a very difficult time sleeping in his own bed. So, occasionally, he would sleep with his parents. Well, one night in March of 1975, James woke up to a loud noise and a blinding light right outside of his window. So he ran to his parents' room and then climbed into bed between them, pulling the covers up over his head. And for just a second, he felt safe. But that feeling was just an illusion, because before long, he heard those footsteps coming down the hall, the same unnatural footsteps that he had heard before. Well, the footsteps entered the bedroom and then stopped at the foot of the bed. When he slowly lowered the blanket, he saw 3 gray figures, huge bulbous heads, dark, almond-shaped eyes, staring back at him with this empty, unnatural gaze. Well, he screamed for his parents, shook them, begged them to wake up, but they didn't budge. Then a powerful thought echoed throughout his mind. Stop screaming. Your parents cannot help you. You are coming with us. Well, the next moment, he was floating through the house, and just like before, completely paralyzed and unable to scream. He was taken through that glowing amber porthole to that cold, sterile room, and then to that waiting metal table where they did those same horrible things they had done before. All of it cold, clinical, detached. The pain, once again, was unbearable. When it was over, he found himself back in his own bed, waking up to the sound of his mother's voice calling him for school, as if nothing had happened. But of course, something had happened. And it would happen to poor James again and again and again. Over the years, the Greys returned repeatedly. By the summer of 1980, James was 14 years old, and the terrifying visits from the Greys had become, well, just part of his regular life. It was a nightmare, yes, but one that he just couldn't wake up from. Then, on one warm July night, while he was lying on the trampoline in the backyard, staring up at the stars, a bright light appeared in the sky and then moved toward him at incredible speed. A moment later, he found himself in an extremely peaceful and familiar environment, full of light and love. He had been here before, when he was 6 years old, and for the first time in years, James truly felt safe. And right in the middle of that emotion, a humanoid, blue woman entered his awareness, and he recognized her instantly, Loren. Well, during this encounter, James was finally told why the furnace people had kept coming for him. Loren said that the furnace people were really actually just an alien race known on Earth as the Greys. She told him that over time, this race had squandered their connection to love, light, and higher consciousness, and now they were just a sliver more than soulless entities. She said that they had become cold, scientific, and methodical, focused inward, only on their own survival. She explained that they had been taking him because of who he really was. Wow, at that his eyes grew big. Who he really was? Well, who was he? Well, she explained that he was not from Earth, not entirely, anyway. She said that he carried the light of Arcturia within him, and that's why he was so important to these Greys. She told him that over time he would remember who he really was, and he would learn ways to resist them. Well, with that, James closed his eyes, and a few moments later, he found himself back on that trampoline, staring up at the stars, alone. But he was no longer the same person who had laid down that night. No, something inside of him, something powerful, had begun to awaken. Although James was growing into something more, the Greys still did not stop taking him. As a matter of fact, his spiritual growth seemed in some way to motivate them even more. And over time, the procedures that they did to him began to leave real damage in his physical body. Doctors would later discover, and I thought this was extremely interesting, a hole had somehow developed between the chambers of his heart, damage that usually only comes from open heart surgery. He also suffered repeated cerebral spinal fluid leaks, so severe that on one occasion, the doctor could actually see James's brain pulsating through an opening in his sinus cavity. And all through his life, different doctors always asked the same question: have you ever had any serious head injury? And the answer would always come back, no. Well, by the early 90s, James was no longer just a frightened little boy. No, he had grown into a man, married a woman named Holly, and had children of his own. But the Greys, well, they never stopped coming for him. And even though he had more information, he was still powerless to stop them. Well, that is, until an alien from another race entered his life. One late night, a portal opened in his bedroom, and a tall woman with a shimmering white skin and long white hair stepped through. She told James that her name was Orla, and she was from the planet of Tau. She said that she was there to teach him how to raise his frequency and thereby block the Greys' control, and even how to command them with his thoughts. Well, James listened and he learned, and for the first time, he felt like he had real weapons that he could use against them. Well, then came the night where he got the chance to test what he had learned. It was 1996, and he and Holly had just moved back into his childhood home. At some point during the night, he heard noises down in the basement, and he just knew that the furnace people would be coming that night. So, bravely, he made a bed on the couch in the basement. For the first time, he would confront them, and he would do it as soon as they arrived. Well, after a while, he drifted off to sleep. But sure enough, sometime during the night, he was awakened by a bright light created by the opening of a portal. 2 gray aliens stepped through, and they thought that they were just going to take him like before. But this time, they thought wrong.
I closed my eyes and I channeled all of the light in my heart and pushed it into the Greys' minds. I felt them step back as I projected my thoughts forward. You will never touch me again.
At that, and for the first time in his life, the Greys stopped, seemingly held back by some invisible force. But after a second, they stepped forward again.
I stretched my mind into a higher frequency of consciousness and projected to them even stronger. Leave me alone. Leave my house. You have no power over me.
At that, the Greys stood in confusion, and then they backed up into the portal and disappeared. James had won his first battle, and maybe that's all that it took, and after that, they just gave up, because from that moment on, they stayed away. Days turned into months, the months turned into years. A full decade passed, and there was no sign of them. But unfortunately for James, the Greys weren't done with him. Not yet. No, maybe they were just regrouping, or perhaps they were just waiting for him to forget how to use his new abilities, kind of letting him drop into a false sense of security before they returned and tried again. Because in 2012, a little after James had went to bed, he rolled over and he saw two Greys standing in his bedroom doorway. And then the paralysis hit him. It hit him hard. And for just a moment, it was old times and he couldn't move or speak. And only after James was under their control did the Greys enter the room. But James had not forgotten how to use his new abilities. No, he just needed a moment to catch up and refocus his thoughts. They had no power here, and he knew it, and he projected that into their minds. Well, at that, the Greys stumbled backward. But a moment later, a third, larger Grey entered the scene. He appeared near the window. Was this part of the plan? Allow James to tap into his abilities, show them what he had, and then they would turn up the heat. Well, if that was their plan, it didn't work. No, James stood his ground. He projected his thoughts even harder into their consciousness, and in that surge of power, he actually levitated several inches off of the floor. Well, a moment later, the Greys couldn't resist. They opened a porthole, and they fled. James had resisted the Greys twice. Well, as the light of this portal was fading and James was collapsing onto the floor, another voice echoed in his consciousness, this one coming from a feeling of warmth, love, and protection. The voice called itself Natutrian, and it said that she was sent there to help James through the next phase of his awakening, a process that would require much more than just resisting the Greys. A process that would require James to look deep into his own fears, and then somehow to let them go. By 2023, James Kelly had lived with this secret for 50 years. He had been taken, experimented on, and left with permanent damage, both to his brain and to his heart. He had been taught how to fight back by beings that most people don't even believe exist, in a war that any skeptical person would say is just make-believe. And deeper than all of this, something inside of him had begun to shift. He started feeling a connection with life at the most fundamental level. James was slowly becoming something more. Yet still, he was stalling. Then one morning in August of 2023, a voice entered his consciousness, and it said that it was time, that James could no longer put off the inevitable, that he must work to let go of his fears and to allow his consciousness to expand into a higher level of awareness and to fulfill his purpose as a starseed child here on Earth. Well, over the next couple of months, some very interesting things happened. One of them was a unique training session that James went through. He was taken through this porthole into a distant planet where he was taught how to control his negative emotions. He was shown this black cylinder, about 6 inches long, and he was told that this cylinder, now, check this out, emits low vibrational frequencies that mimic sorrowful emotions and dark life forms like those from Zeta Reticuli. A cylinder that emits emotions. Now that's intense. Well, James was told to brace himself because once the cylinder was activated, it was going to cause him to feel all types of sadness, loss, and fear that he had held deep inside of him for years. Then the cylinder was turned on.
Instantly, terror and dread filled my heart. I saw my dad laying in his coffin and my mom sobbing as she held his hand. "Mom, it's James," I found myself saying. "I'm here for you. Let me help you." My mom just looked at me, her expression filled with grief. Then she turned and continued to cry over my dad. "Mom, I'm here." I tried to take her hand, but my fingers passed through hers as if she wasn't even there. Darkness and fear enveloping me. I literally thought I was gonna die.
James had been told to concentrate on peace, love, and tranquility, but in that moment, he wasn't able to grab onto any of those emotions. But this type of training continued, and although he never got perfect at it, over time, he did get much better at handling those negative emotions. Another thing that happened during this time is that he finally told Holly what he had been going through his whole life, and that he needed to share his experience with the world. Interestingly, and being the romantic that I am, I thought this was awesome. She believed him instantly, no questions asked. And together they looked through the internet and found an organization that investigated alien encounters. A few days later, he was in a conference call telling a story to this organization and ultimately to the world. And that would have been a nice, tidy ending to James's story. But life, unlike fiction, doesn't always have these nice, tidy endings. No, life goes on. And the Greys, well, they wanted that magic that James had, that genetic code, and they had no plans on giving up. They decided that the only way that they were going to get past James's new defenses and obtain the last pieces of this genetic code that they needed was to kill him and then take it from his lifeless body. So, on September 1st, 2024, while James was sleeping, a glowing circle of light appeared at the foot of his bed. And then 4 massive figures stepped through, beings that were unlike any that James had seen before. They stood 7 to 8 foot tall, with heavily muscled bodies and skin the color of dark stone, textured like elephant hide. These were not the same Greys that James had known his entire life. No, these beings were much, much more dangerous, and they moved with terrifying speed. 2 of them grabbed James before he even realized what was happening. One placed a cold hand on his forehead, and instantly, James was paralyzed. He tried to use what he had been taught, every technique, every frequency, but nothing worked. This new technology that they were using seemed to bypass his heart and his soul completely. While they carried him through that portal with ease, as his body remained completely frozen. On the other side, everything was gloomy and felt emotionally empty. Well, they put him on that table and strapped his arms and legs down with those metal bands. Then one of them forced a clear dome over his head, while the other placed this thin, conforming sheet over his body, which began to tighten all around him, slowly sucking the life out of him. Well, James fought. He fought with everything that he had, but nothing worked. He was totally saturated in feelings of pain, fear, and utter hopelessness. They had him exactly where they wanted him. On the screen above him, he saw 2 images. One was of his body with every organ and system displayed, and the other showed his DNA. Several of the beings gathered around the screen, pointing and speaking in agitated tones. Parts of his DNA, and this may be a piece of the mystery, glowed yellow, and the beings were excited about that. Well, a second later, they injected James with this orange fluid, and his heart began to slow. His lungs felt like they were on fire.
I could actually feel my heart slowing, and I knew that I only had moments left.
Everything that he had went through, all of the stuff that he had been taught about how to control his emotions, overcome his fears, all of it had been for nothing. Some starseed child he was. But just before he drew his last breath, another portal opened. This one exploded wide and fast, and a team of beings in white suits burst into the room. They moved with lightning precision, and within moments the tightness in the room was gone and James could breathe again. Well, he was told not to be too critical on himself, that it actually took everything that the Greys had to do this, that this was their one last-ditch effort to get what they needed from James. Then from that day forward, James would be strong enough to resist even their best efforts. Every day since, James has lived in peace, love, and happiness, becoming better and better at handling his negative emotions. And whether the story is true or not, I think that it holds a clear lesson, and that's this. Once the rest of us can learn to live in peace, love, and happiness like James, well then, this entire planet will become something magical. Don't you think? James's story is insane. When Amy first brought it to me, I wasn't even sure that I wanted to share it. It sounds beyond fantastical, right? And there's very little, if any, hard evidence that backs up James's story. But, surprisingly, there is more circumstantial evidence than one might think. Starting with that hole in James's heart. Outside of the fact that it seems to be the perfect representation for this entire story, right? It's the hole in the human heart that keeps everyone from living in peace, love, and happiness, right? Outside of that, this hole in James's heart is actually physically there, and there's no clear scientific reason as to why. He's never had any open heart surgery, at least not here on Earth by any human doctors. And then there's the fact that James's is not a secluded story. No, there are literally millions of others who also claim that they are starseed children, beings whose souls have been placed here on Earth to help the rest of us raise our vibration. Are they all wrong? Maybe. You know, being a commentator, I feel like some stories that I share should be believed or meant to be believed. Like the incredible survival stories that I shared just a couple of weeks ago. People who survived impossible odds. You should see it, it's pretty awesome. And other stories I share, well, maybe some are just meant to wake us up, make us think. Perhaps this story is both.
Originally, I was confused as to why the aliens wanted James's DNA. I mean, there is no officially documented evidence that humans have any type of alien DNA. But then I looked a little deeper and discovered that many believe there is more to our DNA than scientists can detect. In some starseed circles, people believe in 12-strand DNA. Please let me know if you've heard of this. These additional 10 etheric or spiritual strands are tied to higher consciousness, intuition, spiritual memory, and even dormant abilities. The belief is that starseed children may carry a kind of special coding that helps awaken those hidden layers. If this is true, well then, in James's story, it explains why the beings in his experiences seem so focused on his DNA. So whether you see the 12-strand DNA idea as literal, symbolic, spiritual, or just part of the mythology around the starseed children, it does add another layer to the mystery. And honestly, if I ever wake up with 12 activated strands of DNA, the first thing I'm going to do is use them to manifest coffee. And speaking of coffee, if you'd like to support the research we put into stories like this, you can buy us a virtual coffee at the link below. It really does help us keep digging into these strange, complicated, and fascinating cases. Thank you so much for watching.